My name is Maya, and I am 30 years old. 14 hours of grueling labor ending in an emergency C-section should have been the hardest part of my week. I was lying in a sterile hospital bed in Atlanta, the numbness from the epidural finally wearing off and leaving a dull burning sensation in my lower abdomen. My newborn twins Zion and Zuri were asleep in the nursery down the hall. I was exhausted, bruised, and expecting my husband to walk through the door with a bouquet of flowers and tears of joy in his eyes. Instead, the heavy wooden door of my recovery room swung open, and the potent scent of Chanel No. 5 instantly choked out the clinical smell of rubbing alcohol. My mother-in-law Vivienne marched in. She was a prominent Atlanta socialite, dripping in designer jewelry and wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most people make in a year. She was flanked by my husband Julian and a man in a sharp charcoal suit carrying a leather briefcase. There were no balloons. There were no smiles or words of congratulations. Vivienne walked straight to the side of my bed, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. Without a single word of greeting, she opened her designer purse, pulled out a plastic DNA testing kit, and tossed it onto my lap. It bounced off my hospital gown and landed next to my hand. Before I could even process what was happening, the man in the suit stepped forward and dropped a thick stack of legal documents right next to it. Printed at the very top in bold letters were the words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." Before I continue the story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been entirely blindsided by the people who were supposed to protect you, or if you have ever had to stand up to a family who severely underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to hear how I turned their ultimate betrayal into my greatest victory. I stared at the heavy stack of divorce papers and then looked up at Vivienne. She stood over me like a judge about to deliver a brutal sentence. Her perfectly coiffed hair and flawless makeup felt like a calculated insult to my swollen face and exhausted body. She sneered, crossing her arms over her chest. "Sign the papers," she demanded, her voice echoing harshly in the quiet room. "Julian is not throwing away his inheritance for this mistake. You really thought you could secure the bag by getting pregnant, did you not?" I looked past her, desperately searching for Julian. He was standing near the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring intently at the floor tiles as if they were the most fascinating thing in the world. "Julian," I whispered, my voice hoarse from hours of screaming in the delivery room. "What is going on?" Vivienne stepped into my line of sight, aggressively blocking him from my view. "Do not play dumb with us," she snapped. "You have been running a long con since the day you met my son. We know exactly who you are and what you want. You are a public university graduate with a completely useless degree. You call yourself a freelance video editor, but we all know that is just a polite way of saying you are broke, unemployed, and looking for a meal ticket. Do you honestly believe the Vance family is going to hand over a $20 million trust fund to a peasant who splices together cheap wedding videos for a living?" Her words were like venom. For 3 years, I had smiled through her passive-aggressive comments at Thanksgiving dinners and country club galas. I had politely ignored her blatant disgust for my working-class upbringing. I had endured her snide remarks about my modest wardrobe and my lack of elite social memberships because Julian always promised me that we were a team. He swore that his mother's obsession with status and generational wealth did not matter to him. Now she was standing in my hospital room, mere hours after I had been cut open to deliver her grandchildren, calling me a peasant to my face. The lawyer cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Vance, if you could just review the terms." Vivienne cut him off sharply. "There is nothing for her to review. She gets absolutely nothing. Julian's trust fund strictly stipulates that he must marry within his social class or face total disinheritance. I warned him about you from the start. I told him you were nothing but a gold-digging opportunist trying to trap him with children. And now that the Trust Review Board is threatening to cut him off entirely, he has finally come to his senses. Sign the papers, take your little DNA swabs so we can confirm those bastards are even his, and get out of our lives." I felt a sudden coldness wash over me, completely freezing any tears that might have tried to form in my eyes. I pushed myself up slightly against the pillows, wincing as the fresh stitches in my stomach pulled tight. I did not look at Vivienne. I looked straight at the man I had married. Julian. "Look at me," I said, making sure my voice was entirely steady, despite the intense physical agony I was in. "Look at me and tell me this is what you want." He finally lifted his head. His handsome face, the one I had woken up next to for the last 3 years, looked completely unrecognizable. There was no warmth, no love, and not even an ounce of guilt. He simply wore the annoyed expression of a man who was severely inconvenienced by my presence. "Maya, you have to understand." He began, his tone dripping with a pathetic attempt at reason. "I cannot lose the real estate company. I cannot lose my place in this family. You know how my mother is. She is going to cut me completely out of the firm and the inheritance. I grew up with a very specific standard of living. I cannot just give all that up to go live in some average suburb and clip grocery coupons with you." I stared at him in complete silence, letting the sheer weight of his words sink in. He was actively choosing his trust fund over his wife and his newborn twins. He was actually standing there watching his mother verbally abuse me while I was still bleeding from major surgery and defending his right to a luxury lifestyle. "I cannot be poor, Maya," he continued, as if that somehow justified abandoning his new family. "It is just not who I am. But I am a reasonable guy. I will make sure you are not left completely empty-handed. If you sign the papers today without making a fuss or going to the media, I will let you keep the old Honda Civic. You can use it to get around town with the babies. And I will personally pay for the first 2 months of rent for a small apartment for you, assuming the DNA test proves those kids are actually mine. After that, you are entirely on your own." The sheer audacity of his offer hung heavily in the sterile hospital air, an old Honda Civic and 2 months of rent in a cheap apartment. That was his generous severance package for the woman who had just carried his children for 9 months and suffered through a traumatic birth. The room became suffocatingly quiet. Vivienne wore a triumphant smirk on her flawless face, clearly expecting me to burst into hysterical tears to beg Julian to stay, to grovel on my knees for their financial support. The corporate lawyer stood there with a silver pen extended toward me, waiting for me to break down and surrender. But I did not break. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, a strange and profound sense of peace settled over my entire body. The burning pain in my abdomen seemed to fade completely into the background. In that hospital bed, staring at the pathetic coward I had called my husband, and the vicious woman who controlled his every move, I realized something incredibly liberating. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. They fully believed they were discarding a helpless, broke video editor who relied on their family name to survive. They thought they held all the power in this room because of their country club memberships and their trust funds. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating the quiet ones. I reached out with a steady hand and took the silver pen from the lawyer. I did not sign the divorce papers immediately. I tapped the pen rhythmically against the heavy legal clipboard, looking directly into Julian's eyes. "You want out," I said softly. "You want to keep your precious trust fund and your luxury life. You want to walk away from Zion and Zuri to protect your status. Fine, but if I sign this document today, we do it my way." I turned my attention to the lawyer, who was nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly on the hospital floor. I told him to flip to the final page of his neatly typed document and draft a legally binding addendum right now. Julian blinked rapidly, clearly confused by my sudden shift in demeanor. Vivienne scoffed loudly, crossing her arms and asking what delusional financial demands I was about to make. I ignored her, entirely refusing to give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction, and kept my eyes locked on the lawyer. "I want full and uncontested legal and physical custody of Zion and Zuri," I stated clearly, "and I want Julian to voluntarily and permanently terminate his parental rights. 100%. No visitation rights, no holiday splits, no legal claim to them whatsoever. The room went completely silent again. Vivienne let out a sharp laugh, looking absolutely thrilled by the prospect of erasing my children from their pristine family tree. Julian, however, actually hesitated for a fraction of a second. But Maya, he started taking a half step forward. They are my kids. I tilted my head and gave him a look of pure disgust. Are they really your kids, Julian? Because 5 minutes ago, you were more than willing to trade them for a trust fund and an old Honda Civic. If you want a clean break to go play the wealthy bachelor without any burdens, you are going to pay the price. You sign away your parental rights right now, or I will drag this divorce out in family court for years. I will demand substantial spousal support, I will demand a massive chunk of your real estate firm, and I will make sure the judge orders you to pay the absolute maximum amount of child support for the next 18 years. The mere mention of 18 years of massive child support payments hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. I watched the greed and panic wage a brief war in his eyes. Vivienne quickly grabbed his arm and hissed directly into his ear. She told him this was a massive blessing in disguise, that he was getting off entirely scot-free without having to pay a single dime to a gold digger. She reminded him that the big corporate merger was coming up, and he needed a spotless public record without any messy custody battles dragging his name through the mud. He nodded slowly, his inherent cowardice winning out just as I knew it would. Julian turned to the lawyer, his face pale and sweating slightly, and told him to write it up exactly as I requested, no questions asked. Within 10 minutes, the newly drafted documents were printed at the nurse station and brought back into the room. Julian took the silver pen and signed his name on the dotted line, legally erasing himself from the lives of his newborn children just to save his wallet. I took the pen next and signed the divorce decree, feeling a massive weight lift off my chest. Just as the lawyer was gathering the freshly signed paperwork into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut, the hospital room door slammed open again. Julian's younger sister Chloe practically pranced into the room. She was 28 years old, chronically unemployed, and funded entirely by the exact same trust fund that was currently destroying my marriage. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors and carrying an iced matcha latte, as if she were strolling through a high-end shopping mall. "Oh good, I am not too late for the eviction," she announced loudly, completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting in a hospital bed recovering from major abdominal surgery. Chloe did not even glance toward the hallway where her newborn niece and nephew were resting in the nursery. Instead, her eyes darted around my small recovery room like a vulture looking for leftover scraps. She quickly spotted my expensive leather diaper bag resting on the plastic visitor chair in the corner. It was a high-end designer piece that Julian had bought me for our baby shower just a few months prior. Without a single second of hesitation, Chloe marched over her heavy boots, stomping on the floor, and snatched it up by the leather handles. "I am taking this back," she declared, slinging it over her shoulder with a triumphant smirk. "This was bought with Vance family money, and since you are no longer a Vance, you definitely do not get to keep the luxury perks." I watched in silence as she rudely rummaged through the side pockets, pulling out my personal items. She dumped my lip balm, my phone charger, and a few newborn onesies directly onto the cold linoleum floor. Julian did absolutely nothing to stop his sister. Vivienne just smiled approvingly at the blatant disrespect. "You need to pack up whatever cheap trash you brought with you and leave our property behind," Chloe sneered, kicking one of the tiny white onesies out of her way with her expensive shoe. "I brought some heavy-duty plastic garbage bags from home if you need them. They are much more suited to your personal aesthetic anyway." I looked at the three of them standing there, a so-called prominent family of high society elites, standing in a sterile hospital room, actively bullying a woman who had just given birth. They were petty, cruel, and completely devoid of basic human decency. They truly thought stripping me of a designer diaper bag and a prestigious last name was the ultimate punishment. I slowly pushed the thin hospital blanket off my legs. Every single movement sent a sharp, agonizing jolt of pain through my surgical incision, but I refused to show them an ounce of weakness. I carefully swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up on my own 2 feet, ignoring the burning sensation tearing through my core. I picked up my phone charger and the onesies from the floor, placing them into a simple canvas tote bag I had brought from home. "Keep the bag, Chloe," I said calmly. "It matches your completely hollow personality." I walked out of the recovery room without looking back at any of them. I made my way down the brightly lit hospital corridor toward the maternity nursery. The nurses were incredibly kind and gentle, treating me with the basic human decency my own husband lacked, helping me get Zion and Zuri carefully settled into their double stroller. Looking down at their tiny, perfect faces sleeping so peacefully under the warm blankets, I felt a fierce and protective fire ignite deep inside my chest. Julian absolutely did not deserve to be their father. The Vance family did not deserve to have their incredibly toxic bloodline attached to these beautiful, innocent children. I had everything I would ever need right here in this stroller. Pushing the heavy carriage forward, I slowly made my way back down the hallway toward the main elevator bank. The physical pain in my abdomen was blinding with every single step I took, sending waves of nausea through my body. But my mind had never been clearer or more focused on the future. As I approached the main exit of the maternity ward, I realized I had to pass by my former recovery room one last time to reach the elevators. The heavy wooden door was still propped wide open. Inside the room, Julian, Vivienne, and Chloe were actually popping a bottle of smuggled champagne. They were laughing loudly and clinking cheap plastic hospital cups together, celebrating my abrupt departure like they had just won the state lottery. I stopped the double stroller right in the doorway. The slight squeak of the wheels caught their attention, and the obnoxious laughter died down instantly as they turned to look at me. I was pale, thoroughly exhausted, and still bleeding from major surgery just hours prior. I was wearing oversized gray sweatpants and holding a cheap canvas tote bag over my shoulder. To them, I looked like a defeated, broken woman crawling away with absolutely nothing to my name. I met Julian's gaze one final time across the room. The sheer arrogance written all over his face was genuinely nauseating. He truly believed he had outsmarted me today. He truly believed he had protected his precious inheritance from a desperate gold digger who had nothing else to fall back on. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. It was the kind of unnerving smile that made Vivienne subtly take a step back and lower her plastic cup. "You just sold your legacy for pennies, Julian," I said, making sure my voice echoed clearly down the quiet hospital corridor, so he would never forget the words. "I hope you enjoy the inheritance." Before he could respond, before he could even process the absolute certainty and hidden threat in my tone, I turned the stroller around and walked straight into the waiting elevator. The metal doors slid shut with a satisfying click, cutting off his confused face from my view. They thought they had won the morning, but they had absolutely no idea that I already owned the entire game board and they were just playing right into my hands. 3 months passed since the day I walked out of that hospital ward. 3 months of healing, bonding with my beautiful twins, and quietly maneuvering the massive financial empire I had built from the ground up. I traded the cheap canvas tote bag and oversized sweatpants for something far more fitting of my actual tax bracket. It was a crisp Saturday evening in downtown Atlanta, and the city's elite had gathered at the Grand Biltmore Hotel for the annual Black Excellence Charity Gala. I stepped out of the back of a sleek black chauffeured Maybach, the cool night air hitting my face. I wore a custom emerald green silk gown that draped perfectly over my recovered figure, paired with understated but incredibly expensive diamond earrings. There was no trace of the exhausted, bleeding woman Julian had abandoned. I looked breathtaking, radiating a quiet, untouchable power. I handed my platinum invitation to the security detail at the entrance and glided into the massive ballroom. The space was dripping in opulence with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over tables adorned with white orchids. This was the ultimate playground for Atlanta's high society. Politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and legacy members of exclusive organizations mingled over glasses of vintage champagne. My babies Zion and Zuri were safe at home in my high-security penthouse, being watched by a highly credentialed elite night nanny. I was here on business, completely unbothered by the social games being played around me. I walked over to the bar and ordered a simple sparkling water with lime. As I turned around to survey the room, my eyes landed precisely where I expected them to. Across the ballroom, bathed in the soft glow of a spotlight, stood Vivienne and Chloe. They were holding court at a VIP table, surrounded by a tight circle of local politicians and wealthy socialites. Vivienne was wearing an ostentatious silver gown that screamed for attention, gesturing wildly with a glass of champagne as she entertained her captive audience. Chloe was standing right beside her wearing a borrowed designer dress and laughing entirely too loudly at whatever joke the mayor had just told. They looked like the absolute picture of generational wealth and untouchable privilege. But I knew the truth. I knew their accounts were bleeding dry, and tonight was going to be the beginning of their very public unraveling. It only took a few minutes for the vultures to spot their prey. I was standing near a towering floral arrangement when I saw Vivienne abruptly stop mid-sentence. Her eyes locked onto me, her heavily contoured face dropping into an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. She blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process how the broke, unemployed video editor she had thrown away was currently standing in a ballroom where tickets cost $5,000 a head. For a brief second, I thought she might actually possess the social grace to ignore me and save herself the embarrassment. But Vivienne was a woman driven entirely by ego and cruelty. Instead of turning away, her eyes narrowed into a venomous glare. She set her champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray with a sharp clink and marched straight across the ballroom toward me, her heels sinking aggressively into the plush carpet. Chloe trailed closely behind her like a loyal attack dog sensing blood. As they approached, I did not move an inch. I simply stood my ground, holding my sparkling water and offering a pleasant, completely unbothered smile. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Vivienne announced. She intentionally raised her voice to a theatrical volume, ensuring that the surrounding tables of politicians and elites stopped their conversations to watch the impending drama. I have to admit, Maya, I am genuinely shocked. I did not realize the event organizers had started handing out charity tickets to the homeless. A collective gasp rippled through the immediate crowd. People began to whisper, their eyes darting between my designer gown and Vivienne's furious expression. I took a slow sip of my water. "Hello, Vivienne," I replied calmly. "It is a lovely evening for a gala, is it not?" My absolute refusal to look intimidated only infuriated her further. She took a step closer, her voice echoing off the marble pillars. "Do not play games with me!" she snapped loudly, making sure the entire ballroom could hear her slander. "Everyone here knows exactly what you are. You are a desperate little gold digger who tried to trap my son, and when he finally cut you off, you came crawling into this event to hunt for a new sugar daddy. How did you even get past security? Did you sleep with one of the valet drivers?" The silence in our corner of the ballroom was deafening. The sheer trashiness of her outburst was a stark contrast to the elegance of the evening, but Vivienne was too blinded by her own arrogance to realize how foolish she looked. Chloe chimed in, pointing a manicured finger at my emerald gown. "That dress is probably a cheap knockoff she bought online." Chloe laughed maliciously. "Or maybe she rented it using the last few pennies Julian threw at her before we kicked her to the curb." I let them talk. I let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly could in front of Atlanta's most powerful people. I did not defend my dress. I did not defend my presence. I simply watched them perform their pathetic circus act. Seeing that I was not reacting with tears or anger, Vivienne decided to deliver what she believed was the ultimate crushing blow. She turned slightly to address the growing audience of onlookers wearing a triumphant smirk. "You are wasting your time looking for a wealthy man to save you tonight," Maya Vivienne declared proudly, her voice dripping with extreme arrogance. "Because my son is moving on to bigger and better things. In case you have not heard the news, Julian is already engaged to the daughter of a state senator. A woman with actual class, actual breeding, and an actual pedigree, not some state school peasant." She paused, letting the murmurs of the crowd swell before delivering her grand finale. "And if that is not enough to send you running back to the slums, Julian's real estate firm is merely weeks away from finalizing a monumental $50 million acquisition. We are being bought out by Apex Holdings, one of the most powerful corporate behemoths in the world. Once that ink dries, Julian will be untouchable. The Vance family name will be cemented in this city forever. So do yourself a favor, Maya. Take your fake dress, call a cheap cab, and disappear before I have security throw you out into the street where you belong. Vivienne crossed her arms, panting slightly from the adrenaline of her own vicious speech. She looked incredibly proud of herself, fully expecting me to crumble into a million pieces at the revelation of Julian's new engagement and massive corporate payday. She expected me to feel small, worthless, and entirely defeated. Instead, I just smiled. It was a genuine, terrifyingly calm smile. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water, the ice clinking softly against the glass. The absolute irony of her boasting about a $50 million buyout from a faceless corporate behemoth was almost too delicious to handle. She was standing there bragging about Apex Holdings, saving her family, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently screaming at the sole founder-owner and CEO of that very company. I let the silence stretch out, savoring the moment before I finally spoke. "I am incredibly happy for Julian," I finally said, keeping my voice entirely steady and completely devoid of the devastation they so desperately wanted to see. "I genuinely hope this new corporate merger brings him exactly what he deserves." My calm demeanor completely derailed their planned spectacle. Vivienne frowned, her heavy makeup creasing as she tried to comprehend why I was not running out of the ballroom in tears. Chloe, however, was visibly infuriated. She hated being unbothered, and she absolutely despised seeing me hold my own in a room she felt belonged exclusively to her family. Her face twisted into a truly ugly scowl. She grabbed a full glass of dark red Cabernet off a passing waiter's silver tray. With a calculated and dramatic pivot, she intentionally lunged forward, slamming her shoulder directly into my chest. The heavy red wine splashed violently out of the crystal glass, soaking the entire front of my custom emerald silk gown. The dark crimson liquid dripped down the expensive fabric, leaving a massive ruined stain right over my heart. Several guests standing nearby gasped loudly, taking quick steps backward to avoid the splash zone. "Oh my goodness, I am so incredibly clumsy," Chloe mocked, her voice dripping with fake innocence as she stared at the ruined dress. "I guess that is what happens when you stand in the way of people who actually belong here." She tossed the empty crystal glass onto a nearby silver cocktail table. It shattered on impact, sending sharp shards of glass scattering across the polished floor. "You better head back to the kitchen, Maya." Chloe laughed maliciously, looking around the room to make sure her audience was still watching her performance. "I am sure if you offer to wash dishes for the rest of the night, the catering manager might give you enough tips to cover the dry cleaning bill for that cheap little knockoff you are wearing." Vivienne let out a sharp, approving laugh, placing a heavily jeweled hand on Chloe's arm. "Leave the trash for the janitors," Vivienne instructed loudly. "We have a much more exclusive after-party to attend on the other side of town. Let us go get the car." They turned their backs on me, their heels clicking aggressively as they marched out of the ballroom, completely satisfied with their public performance. They had successfully humiliated me in front of the mayor, several city council members, and the elite socialites of Atlanta. Or at least that is exactly what they thought they had done. I stood there feeling the cold wine soaking through the silk against my skin. The hotel manager rushed over his face, pale, offering me a warm towel and profusely apologizing for the incident. I gently waved him away with a polite smile. I did not need a towel, I needed a completely different kind of cleanup. Instead of running toward the ladies' room to cry over my ruined dress, I calmly reached into my evening clutch and pulled out my phone. I opened my highly encrypted messaging app, the one exclusively linked to the senior wealth management team at my corporate headquarters. I quickly typed out a single precise instruction to my lead financial director. "Execute the auto loan withdrawal for the Porsche immediately. Send the recovery unit to the Grand Biltmore Hotel right now." I hit send and slipped the phone back into my purse. 2 years ago, when Julian and I were still happily married, Chloe had completely destroyed her credit score by maxing out 6 different credit cards to fund her lavish shopping addiction. She desperately wanted a brand new custom-ordered Porsche to parade around Atlanta, but no reputable bank would ever approve a loan for an unemployed socialite with a massive history of defaults. Julian had begged me to co-sign the loan for her, claiming it would help her build a sense of responsibility and get her life back on track. I had foolishly agreed, attaching my flawless financial standing to her extravagant $150,000 vehicle. Because of my pristine credit history, she got the lowest interest rate possible and drove off the dealership lot feeling like a true celebrity. But what Chloe completely failed to realize was that as a co-signer, I retained the absolute legal right to withdraw my financial backing at any given moment if she defaulted on her payments, and Chloe had not made a single car payment in over 3 months. Julian had been secretly paying the monthly bill to keep her from getting repossessed, but once we divorced, he stopped making the transfers to save his own money. The only reason the bank had not already seized the car was because my wealth management firm had quietly bought out the loan 2 weeks ago. I now owned the debt on her precious luxury car. I took a deep breath, smoothing down the unsoiled portions of my gown. The crowd was still watching me, expecting a massive meltdown. Instead, I gracefully turned around and began walking slowly out of the ballroom, my head held high. I moved through the lavishly decorated lobby of the hotel, completely ignoring the sympathetic stares from the staff. I followed the exact same path Vivienne and Chloe had just taken toward the main exit. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The valet stand was chaotic, crowded with wealthy patrons waiting for their luxury vehicles to be brought around from the underground parking garage. I stood silently in the shadows near one of the massive stone pillars, waiting for the very first domino of the Vance family empire to finally fall. Chloe was standing at the front of the valet line, tapping her foot impatiently and complaining loudly to the parking attendant about how slow the service was. Vivienne stood beside her, checking her makeup in a silver compact mirror, completely unaware of the massive storm about to hit them. "Bring the white Porsche up right now," Chloe barked at the teenage valet driver, aggressively waving her collection of designer keychains in his face. "We have somewhere important to be, and I am tired of waiting out here in the cold." Just as the valet driver nervously keyed his radio to call the garage, the loud, aggressive roar of a heavy diesel engine echoed down the street. A massive industrial repo tow truck aggressively backed into the hotel driveway, its bright yellow strobe lights flashing wildly and reflecting off the hotel's glass doors. The tow truck operator, a large man wearing a neon reflective vest, hopped out of the cab with a heavy metal clipboard in his hand. He ignored the confused valets and walked straight toward the underground garage exit. Right at that exact moment, a hotel staff member carefully drove Chloe's pristine white Porsche up the ramp. The tow operator immediately stepped in front of the vehicle, holding up his hand to stop it. He quickly checked the vehicle identification number on the dashboard against his clipboard, nodded in confirmation, and signaled his partner in the truck. Within seconds, the hydraulic lift dropped down, and the heavy metal hooks violently locked onto the front axle of the expensive sports car. Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, sprinting forward and violently hitting her hands against the side of the tow truck. "Get away from my car right now. I am going to sue you." "Do you have any idea who my family is? My brother is Julian Vance. Stop stealing my property." The tow operator barely glanced at her. He simply handed the terrified valet driver a standard repossession notice and secured the heavy metal chains. "I am not stealing anything, ma'am," the operator said gruffly over the loud engine noise. "The bank revoked the loan. This vehicle is officially being repossessed for severe non-payment. Step away from the machinery." Chloe looked absolutely panicked, her face draining of all color as she watched the front wheels of her precious status symbol lift off the pavement. Vivienne was yelling at the hotel manager to call the police, completely humiliating themselves in front of the crowd of departing elites. I stepped out from behind the stone pillar, the streetlights illuminating the wine stain on my dress. I walked right up to Chloe, leaning in close so only she could hear me over the chaos. "Did you forget I co-signed that loan to boost your trashy credit score?" I whispered, my voice completely devoid of any pity. "You have not made a payment in 3 months. I just withdrew my backing. Walk home in your heels, Chloe. I turned around, stepped into my waiting Maybach, and left her screaming in the driveway. The drive back was peaceful. The tinted windows of the Maybach shielded me from the glaring city lights. I watched the Atlanta skyline pass by, feeling an immense sense of satisfaction. Chloe was currently throwing a temper tantrum on a public sidewalk, realizing that her plastic crown had just been snatched from her head. But my night was far from over. The chauffeur bypassed the busy downtown residential areas and pulled into the heavily guarded subterranean garage of the Sovereign, one of the most exclusive architectural marvels in the city. A private biometric elevator whisked me up to the top floor. When the steel doors glided open, I stepped directly into the foyer of my $15 million penthouse. The space was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire city. The twinkling lights of the downtown skyline stretched out for miles in every direction, a glittering testament to power and ambition. It was a far cry from the tiny, cramped apartment Julian assumed I was crying in right now. I walked across the imported marble floors, my heels sinking softly into the thick Persian rugs. The air was quiet, smelling faintly of lavender and expensive cedar. I made my way down the wide hallway to the nursery. Inside, the lights were dimmed to a warm amber glow. A highly credentialed pediatric nurse named Sarah, whom I paid handsomely to provide elite overnight care, was sitting in a plush rocking chair, reading a medical journal. She looked up and offered a warm, reassuring smile, quietly letting me know that both babies had just finished their bottles and were sleeping soundly. I walked over to the twin mahogany cribs and looked down at Zion and Zuri. Their tiny chests rose and fell in perfect unison. They were completely safe, entirely protected by a mother who possessed the resources to give them the world. I gently brushed a soft curl from Zion's forehead and kissed Zuri's cheek. I did not need Julian's dirty trust fund to provide for them. I went into my master suite, stripped off the ruined emerald silk gown, and tossed it carelessly into the trash bin. I washed the dried red wine off my chest, tied a heavy cashmere robe around my waist, and poured myself a cup of dark black coffee. Julian genuinely believed I was a helpless victim. He thought his mother had successfully gate-kept wealth from me. Little did they know I was the one pulling every single string. I walked past the grand piano in the living room and approached a thick oak door at the end of the corridor. I placed my hand on the digital biometric scanner next to the heavy oak door. The lock clicked open, revealing my private home office. It did not look like the workspace of a freelance video editor. The room was a state-of-the-art financial command center. The walls were lined with 4 massive Bloomberg terminals, their screens glowing brightly with real-time global market data, scrolling stock tickers, and complex algorithmic charts. I sat down in my high-backed leather executive chair and woke up the primary monitor. It was time to formally introduce the audience to the truth. For the past 7 years, I had maintained a very deliberate and carefully constructed lie. When I first met Julian, I realized very quickly that the men in his social circle were incredibly intimidated by successful self-made women. They wanted trophies, not equals. I also knew that if the Vance family understood the actual scale of my wealth, they would have drained me dry. So I told them I edited small corporate videos and wedding montages from my laptop. It was the perfect cover story. It allowed me to work remotely, keep irregular hours, and stay completely under the radar. The reality was vastly different. I was not a struggling freelancer. I was the anonymous founder, primary shareholder, and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I had built the private equity firm from a tiny tech startup in my college dorm room into a ruthless global corporate behemoth. I had built a board of directors who respected my vision and executed my commands with absolute precision. My company specialized in aggressive corporate takeovers, liquidations, and massive real estate acquisitions. The financial media constantly speculated about the identity of the elusive CEO who orchestrated billion-dollar deals from the shadows, never once suspecting it was a 30-year-old black woman from a working-class neighborhood. When Julian proudly announced to his country club friends that his family business was being acquired by Apex Holdings for $50 million, he was entirely oblivious to the fact that his own wife was the one signing the checks. He had spent our entire marriage treating me like a financial burden, completely unaware that he was sharing a bed with a billionaire. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling a cold, calculating energy settle into my bones. The Vance family had humiliated me, abandoned my children, and tried to strip me of my dignity. Now they were begging my company for a financial bailout. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was almost intoxicating. I opened the secure corporate portal and accessed the highly classified due diligence folder labeled Vance Real Estate Group. It was time to see exactly what kind of kingdom Vivienne was so desperately trying to protect. I cracked my knuckles and began reading through the internal audits. I spent the next 2 hours diving deep into the forensic accounting reports prepared by my acquisitions team. What I discovered was absolutely pathetic. The Vance family projected an image of generational wealth, untouchable prestige, and massive corporate success. But the spreadsheets told a completely different story. Their entire empire was nothing but a fragile house of cards, teetering on the absolute brink of total collapse. I pulled up the private banking records and discovered multiple hidden ledgers that Julian had kept completely off the official books. Vivienne had been secretly bleeding the company dry for years to fund her ridiculous lifestyle. Her lavish charity gala donations, her absurdly expensive Chanel suits, the country club membership dues, and the maintenance on their sprawling mansion were not being paid for by company profits. The real estate firm had not turned a genuine profit in over 4 years. To keep up appearances, Vivienne had resorted to taking out massive high-interest loans from predatory shadow lenders and private equity vultures. She had heavily mortgaged every single commercial property they owned. They were sitting on over $30 million of toxic debt, accruing brutal interest rates that compounded every single month. They were completely insolvent and bleeding cash on a daily basis. The $50 million acquisition deal with Apex Holdings was not a strategic business move for them. It was a desperate last-minute lifeline. They were banking entirely on my company to buy them out so they could pay off their secret creditors before the authorities investigated them for severe financial fraud. They thought they had successfully hidden this toxic debt from the Apex auditors. They thought they were about to walk away with millions of dollars in clean cash. I placed my coffee mug down on the mahogany desk and let out a soft, dark laugh. They had completely miscalculated. I opened a direct encrypted chat window with my senior director of acquisitions. I instructed him to immediately halt all standard merger proceedings with the Vance Real Estate Group. But I did not cancel the deal outright. That would be too easy. Instead, I ordered my team to quietly approach every single shadow lender, private bank, and secret creditor that Vivienne owed money to. I authorized the immediate use of corporate funds to buy up 100% of the Vance family debt. I paid a massive premium to acquire the promissory notes right then and there. Within 45 minutes, the electronic transfers were complete, and the legal documents were securely in my possession. The trap was officially set, and the steel jaws were locked tight. Vivienne and Julian no longer owed money to a dozen scattered anonymous banks. They owed every single penny of their miserable lives directly to me. I now legally possessed the absolute power to foreclose on their business, seize their luxury vehicles, and literally evict them from their ancestral mansion without a single warning. I leaned back in my executive chair, staring at the glowing monitors illuminating the dark room. Julian had told me to take my cheap plastic bags and leave his property. In a few short days, I was going to take absolutely everything he had ever valued. Across town, entirely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging directly over his head, Julian was facing a completely different kind of corporate nightmare. I knew exactly what was happening inside his mahogany-paneled boardroom, because I was the one pulling every single string behind the scenes. I had specifically instructed my proxy negotiators and lead acquisition managers at Apex Holdings to intentionally stall the merger discussions at the 11th hour. The excuse I fed them to relay to the Vance executive team was simple, believable, and utterly devastating to Julian's massive, fragile ego. I had my public relations team leak a highly strategic corporate rumor to the industry insiders. The rumor stated that the Apex board of directors was extremely traditional, deeply conservative, and only wanted to entrust their newly acquired real estate division to a devoted, upstanding family man with impeccable moral character and a spotless public record. Julian had spent the last 3 months living like a reckless, overgrown college fraternity brother with unlimited access to a black card. He was burning through his secret high-interest credit lines by popping ridiculously expensive bottles of champagne at exclusive VIP nightclubs and hosting massive lavish parties on rented yachts. Worse, he was constantly being photographed by local paparazzi and gossip bloggers with a rotating door of aspiring Instagram models draped over his arms in various states of undress. His sudden, highly publicized, and completely ruthless divorce from the mother of his newborn twins had completely destroyed his carefully crafted public image as a responsible, mature businessman. My corporate spies embedded within his building reported that his crisis management team was in a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. Julian was sitting at the head of his massive glass conference table, sweating profusely through his expensive tailored Italian shirt, while his PR director frantically explained that the Apex executives were getting severe cold feet. They told him bluntly that his Playboy lifestyle was a massive corporate liability that was actively tanking the $50 million deal of a lifetime. If he wanted to secure the buyout and save his family from complete financial ruin, he needed to immediately clean up his act and present the flawless, wholesome image of a stable, loving father. Julian was furious, violently throwing his designer pen against the wall, shattering it, and screaming at his staff to somehow fix the problem, bribe the bloggers, and bury the tabloid photos immediately. But even his most expensive fixers told him the harsh truth. There was no quick PR spin for legally abandoning your newborn children in a hospital room just hours after they were born. The media would eventually dig up the divorce records. He was a desperate man backed into a tight corner, desperately needing to manufacture a picture-perfect family that he had just legally thrown away like garbage simply to save a few dollars in child support. While Julian was having a spectacular meltdown in his corporate office, Vivienne was back at the sprawling Vance estate, desperately trying to find a ruthless permanent solution to their rapidly crumbling empire. That same morning, a private medical courier in a pristine white uniform delivered a certified sealed envelope from the hospital's elite genetics laboratory directly to her front door. It was the official paternity DNA test results she had so aggressively demanded on the day my twins were born, the ultimate proof she thought would validate her cruelty. Vivienne practically ripped open the heavy envelope, fully expecting to find the perfect ammunition to publicly destroy my reputation. She had spent months telling everyone in her high society social circle that I was a deceitful gold digger who had gotten pregnant by another man just to trap her wealthy son into an 18-year payday. Instead, the bold black ink on the final page of the medical report confirmed exactly what I already knew to be true. Zion and Zuri were a 99.9% genetic match to Julian. They were undeniably legally and biologically Vance blood. In any normal, loving family, this indisputable proof would be a moment of profound joy, celebration, and immense relief. But Vivienne did not see two beautiful, innocent grandchildren who deserved love and protection. She looked at those test results and saw the ultimate public relations props to save her sinking ship. According to the highly secure wiretaps my private investigators had legally obtained during our aggressive corporate due diligence phase, Vivienne immediately called Julian in a state of manic, calculating excitement. She told him the DNA results were the exact miracle they desperately needed to save the Apex merger and secure the $50 million from the conservative board members. Her twisted logic was breathtakingly cruel, entirely self-serving, and completely devoid of human empathy. She convinced Julian that if they could physically get the twins back into their exclusive custody, they could hire a massive team of professional uniformed nannies to do all the actual parenting behind closed doors. Then they would stage a series of heartwarming, highly stylized family photo shoots for the local luxury magazines and completely rebrand Julian as a dedicated, loving single father fighting heroically to provide for his children. They would hire expensive smear campaigners to paint me as an unstable, financially destitute, and unfit mother who had suffered a severe mental break and run away from her responsibilities. Julian would be hailed as the ultimate savior who bravely stepped up to protect his legacy. It was a perfectly calculated corporate narrative designed entirely to impress the fictional executives of Apex Holdings. Vivienne assured her panicking son that they could completely crush me in the local family court system. After all, they both firmly believed I was just a broke, unemployed freelancer living in a tiny, depressing apartment, completely incapable of affording a decent legal defense against their high-powered attorneys. They decided right then and there to launch a brutal, unapologetic offensive to rip my babies out of my arms, simply to use them as disposable props in a massive financial scam. 2 days later, completely oblivious to the massive legal storm they were trying to bring to my doorstep, I was enjoying a beautiful, crisp afternoon at Piedmont Park. I had dressed Zion and Zuri in matching cream-colored cashmere knit sweaters and was pushing their high-end imported double stroller along the wide paved walking paths beneath the giant oak trees. The park was relatively quiet and peaceful, filled mostly with other affluent mothers, dedicated joggers, and private dog walkers enjoying the bright autumn sunshine. I was holding a cup of artisan herbal tea, breathing in the fresh air, and enjoying the peaceful sounds of the city when the tranquility of our perfect afternoon was violently and abruptly shattered. A massive black Cadillac Escalade with heavily tinted windows and custom chrome rims illegally hopped the stone curb and slammed on its brakes right on the edge of the pedestrian path. It aggressively blocked my route forward, leaving thick black smoking tire marks on the pristine concrete. The heavy doors swung open and Vivienne stepped out wearing a sharp designer trench coat and a pair of oversized black sunglasses that covered half her face, looking like a mob boss arriving to collect a debt. She was accompanied by a tall, highly aggressive-looking man carrying a thick leather briefcase. I recognized him instantly from my corporate files as the high-priced, highly unethical bulldog family lawyer they used to intimidate and crush their weaker business rivals. They marched directly toward me, their faces set in twin expressions of absolute hostility and extreme entitlement. I immediately stopped the stroller, planting my feet firmly on the pavement and shifting my posture into a highly protective stance, making sure my babies were safely behind me. Vivienne stopped just a few feet away, crossing her arms over her chest and looking down at the stroller with a sickeningly fake, predatory smile that made my stomach turn. "Well, Maya," she said, her voice dripping with toxic venom and fake superiority, "it looks like you have had your little vacation. But playtime is officially over." The lawyer stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and shoving them aggressively toward my chest. I did not raise my hands to take them calmly, letting the heavy stack of papers fall to the dirt ground between our shoes. The lawyer cleared his throat, using his loudest, most intimidating courtroom voice specifically to attract the attention of passing pedestrians and cause a public scene. "Maya, we are officially serving you with notice of intent to file for emergency, full physical and legal custody of the minors Zion and Zuri Vance." Vivienne stepped closer, invading my personal space with the overpowering, suffocating scent of her expensive perfume. "You really thought you could just steal Vance's blood and walk away into the sunset with our property?" she sneered loudly, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "Julian is their biological father. He has the absolute legal right to raise them in a proper, wealthy environment, not in whatever rat-infested slum you are currently renting. We are taking the children back today. We will drag you through a custody war so brutal, prolonged, and expensive that it will financially ruin you for the rest of your pathetic life. Hand over the babies right now, or we will have the police arrest you for kidnapping." I looked at the aggressive family lawyer and then at Vivienne's twisted, furious face. I did not scream, and I certainly did not hand over my children. Instead, I calmly pointed toward the upscale organic cafe situated just off the edge of the park plaza. If you are going to threaten me with baseless kidnapping charges, I suggest we do it over a cup of coffee instead of screaming on a public sidewalk where the park rangers are currently watching you, I said, gesturing to a pair of mounted park police officers who had stopped their horses a few yards away to observe the massive Escalade illegally parked on the curb. The lawyer quickly glanced at the officers, leaned in and muttered something into Vivienne's ear. Her jaw tightened, but she gave a sharp nod. We walked into the cafe, the heavy glass door shutting out the noise of the park. It was a bustling, high-end establishment filled with executives on their lunch breaks and affluent locals sipping expensive lattes. We sat down in a leather booth tucked away in the back corner. I parked the double stroller securely by my side, making sure Zion and Zuri were completely shielded from her view. Vivienne did not even bother ordering a drink. She immediately reached into her pristine designer handbag and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. She uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and furiously scribbled across the paper. She ripped the check from the binding and slid it across the smooth marble table, tapping her manicured fingernail against the paper. It was a cashier's check, made out to me for exactly $100,000. I want to be entirely clear with you, Maya, Vivienne said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. Julian and I have absolutely no desire to destroy you in court unless you force our hand. We are offering you a highly generous, completely untraceable exit strategy. Take the cash. It is more money than you have ever seen in your entire miserable life. Take it. Pack whatever cheap belongings you have left. Go back to the ghetto where you belong and let the Vance family raise these children properly. We can give them the finest private schools, the most exclusive country club memberships, and a life of absolute luxury that you could never even dream of providing. If you actually care about these babies, you will walk away right now and let them be raised by people who actually matter. You can use that money to start over. Go buy a little house in a bad neighborhood and pretend none of this ever happened. I looked down at the slip of paper resting on the marble table. $100,000. To a struggling video editor, it would be a life-changing sum. But to me, the CEO of Apex Holdings, who had just spent tens of millions of dollars quietly purchasing her family's entire debt portfolio, it was nothing more than pocket change. It was a pathetic, insulting bribe from a woman who was days away from absolute financial ruin. My silence clearly agitated her. Vivienne leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her eyes filled with a terrifying level of elitist disgust. "You are exactly like your mother," she sneered, weaponizing the memory of the woman who had worked herself to the bone to give me a chance at a better life. Julian told me all about her. A diner waitress who spent 30 years carrying cheap plates of greasy food to truck drivers just to keep the lights on in some rundown apartment. She died with absolutely nothing to her name, Maya. No legacy, no assets, no respect. She was a nobody, and no matter how hard you try to infiltrate our world, you will always be a nobody too. The lawyer sat back, checking his watch, completely comfortable with the vile psychological abuse his client was currently dishing out. Vivienne continued her assault, her voice dripping with unchecked malice. The Vance family has spent 4 generations building a pristine empire of wealth and status in this city. Our bloodline represents excellence, power, and high society. Your bloodline is a disease to our generational wealth. I'll bring nothing but poverty, mediocrity, and lower-class struggle to this table. Do you honestly think I will ever allow my grandchildren to be raised by a woman who grew up clipping coupons and wearing second-hand clothes? Zion and Zuri carry the Vance name, which means they are destined for greatness. If you stay in their lives, you will only poison their future with your peasant mentality. You will drag them down into the mud with you. Sign the custody surrender forms my lawyer has prepared, take the $100,000, and disappear. If you refuse this incredible act of charity, I promise you I will unleash a legal team so vicious that they will legally prove you are an unfit, mentally unstable mother. We will hire private investigators to dig up every single flaw in your life. We will have the judge grant us emergency custody, and you will end up completely broke, fighting a legal battle you can never possibly afford to win. You will lose the babies anyway, but you will also lose your freedom and your sanity in the process. It is your choice, Maya. Take the money and leave quietly, or prepare to be completely annihilated by people who own the very ground you walk on. She sat back against the leather booth, folding her arms across her chest, with an expression of supreme victory. She genuinely believed her brutal verbal assault had broken my spirit. She thought mentioning my deceased mother would trigger an emotional breakdown, forcing me to surrender my children out of sheer intimidation and financial terror. She expected me to pick up the check with trembling hands and walk away in absolute defeat. Instead, I calmly picked up my cup of artisan herbal tea, took a slow sip, and set it back down on the matching ceramic saucer. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear for my mother, because my mother had possessed more integrity in her diner apron than Vivienne Vance would ever possess in her entire miserable life. I slowly reached out and picked up the $100,000 check. I held it up so the overhead lights caught the watermark. Then, with deliberate slowness, I ripped the heavy paper in half. Vivienne gasped, her eyes going wide. I placed the two halves together and ripped them again, repeating the process until the massive bribe was reduced to a pile of tiny, worthless squares. I let the confetti fall onto the marble table. Then I raised my voice. I did not scream, but I projected my words with the sharp, commanding tone of a CEO, ensuring that the affluent patrons sitting at the surrounding tables could hear every single word. If you are going to attempt to bribe me, Vivienne, you should probably make sure your own finances are not a complete public embarrassment, I announced clearly. Half the cafe turned their heads. I pointed a steady finger directly at her chest. For instance, you should stop wearing that gaudy diamond necklace to high-end meetings. It is a cubic zirconia rental from a boutique downtown. The clasp is visibly tarnished, and everyone knows you have been renting it for months, because you cannot afford the insurance on the real one. Vivienne's face flushed a violent shade of red. Her hand flew up to her neck, instinctively covering the fake stones. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, looking around at the audience of wealthy locals who were now openly staring and whispering. But I was not finished. I shifted my aim to the pristine handbag resting next to her. Furthermore, I continued, my voice slicing through the quiet cafe. That Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag you are proudly parading around is a complete counterfeit. The serial number stamped on the inner leather tag was flagged by authenticators over a year ago as a mass-produced fake. You are sitting here threatening me with generational wealth, but your entire life is built on maxed-out credit cards, cheap rentals, and fake designer goods. You do not own the ground I walk on. You barely own the clothes on your back. The cafe was dead silent. A woman at the next table actually pulled out her phone to record the humiliating spectacle. Vivienne looked like she had just been physically struck. Her illusion of untouchable upper-class superiority had been violently shattered in front of the exact demographic she desperately wanted to impress. Panic and profound embarrassment replaced her arrogance. Without uttering another word, she frantically grabbed her fake bag, slid out of the booth, and practically sprinted toward the exit, leaving her highly paid lawyer scrambling to gather his documents and chase after her. I calmly brushed the torn pieces of the check off the table, grabbed my stroller, and stepped back out into the sunshine. I walked back to my penthouse, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. By the time I handed the twins over to their afternoon nanny and poured myself a glass of iced lemon water, my phone began vibrating relentlessly against the granite kitchen island. It was Julian. Vivienne had clearly given him a highly edited, completely delusional version of what had just transpired at the cafe. According to the barrage of text messages now flooding my screen, Vivienne had told him that I had suffered a massive emotional breakdown, ripped up the check in a fit of hysterical jealousy, and fled the coffee shop in tears. Julian was absolutely reveling in this fabricated victory. My screen lit up with a high-resolution photograph of a massive, ostentatious diamond ring resting on the manicured hand of his new fiancée, the state senator's daughter. The caption beneath the photo read, "This is what real wealth looks like. Not that cheap band you wore." I did not reply. A minute later, another photo arrived. This one showed Julian and his new bride to be standing on the balcony of a luxury high-rise holding crystal champagne flutes. "She is ready to be a real mother to my kids," the next text read. "You should have taken the money, Maya. Now you get absolutely nothing." He continued to bombard my phone for the next hour. He sent screenshots of luxury car brochures, links to elite private preschools where he planned to enroll Zion and Zuri, and condescending paragraphs about how I had completely ruined my own life by refusing to play nicely with his mother. He mocked my silence, mistaking my lack of response for absolute devastation. "Cat got your tongue," he texted. "Or did they shut off your phone service already?" He thought I was sitting in a dark, cramped apartment staring at my screen in utter despair. He thought my silence was the ultimate proof of my weakness and defeat. In his arrogant, narrow mind, he had already won the war. He could not comprehend the concept of strategic patience. He did not realize that I was not ignoring him out of sadness. I was ignoring him because I was currently approving the final legal documents that would permanently transfer ownership of his entire real estate portfolio to my holding company. I watched the messages roll in, taking screenshots of every single threat and boast to add to my growing legal arsenal. Let him celebrate his imaginary victory, I thought, placing the phone face down on the cool stone counter. The higher his ego climbed, the more devastating the fall would be. By Friday evening, Julian's frustration over my absolute silence reached a boiling point. He was a man who desperately needed an audience, a narcissist who fed entirely on the reactions of others. When his relentless text messages failed to elicit a single tear or angry response from me, he resorted to calling. My phone rang incessantly, the screen flashing his name over and over again. I let every single call go straight to voicemail, completely unbothered, as I sat in my spacious living room, reviewing the final financial execution strategy with my legal team on a secure tablet. Finally, my screen displayed a new voicemail notification. I tapped the icon and put the phone on speaker, letting Julian's voice fill the quiet room. He sounded completely unhinged, his tone thick with rage and intoxicating arrogance. "You think you can just ignore me, Maya?" His recorded voice sneered the background noise, suggesting he was at a loud, expensive restaurant. "You think giving my mother the silent treatment makes you look strong? It makes you look pathetic. You are nothing but a coward hiding in a hole." He paused, taking a loud sip of what was likely a very expensive unpaid-for drink. "I am calling to give you one final warning because I am a generous guy." He continued, his voice dripping with venom. "I want you to turn on your television this Monday morning. I want you to tune in to the CNBC Financial Network at exactly 9 o'clock. You are going to watch me sign the most massive corporate merger in the history of Atlanta real estate on live national television. You are going to sit on your cheap couch and watch me become a multimillionaire." His breathing grew heavier, the malice in his words sharpening into a direct, unforgiving threat. "Once that ink dries and the Apex Holdings money hits my account, I am coming for you. I am going to hire the most ruthless custody lawyers in the country. We are going to bury you in family court. We will drag your name through the mud, expose your pathetic lower-class background, and prove you are completely unfit to raise my heirs. You will never see Zion and Zuri again. You are finished, Maya. Enjoy your weekend." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. I sat there in the silence of my penthouse, the sheer audacity of his words washing over me. He was actively inviting me to watch my own company broadcast. He was threatening to use my own money to destroy me. He was so completely blinded by his own greed and perceived superiority that he was eagerly walking straight into a public execution of his own making. I deleted the voicemail from my saved folder and permanently forwarded the audio file directly to my lead corporate attorney. The stage was finally set. I stood up from my leather sofa and walked slowly down the long, art-lined hallway toward my master bedroom. I bypassed the main sleeping area and stepped directly into my custom walk-in closet. The space was larger than most luxury apartments, lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors, glass display cases, and rows of meticulously tailored designer clothing. It was a physical manifestation of the immense power and wealth I had quietly accumulated over the past decade. I walked past the casual wear and the evening gowns, heading straight for the section dedicated entirely to high-stakes corporate warfare. My fingers brushed past several dark conservative blazers before stopping on a very specific garment. I pulled the heavy wooden hanger off the rack. It was a bespoke razor-sharp power suit in a deep, unforgiving shade of crimson red. The tailoring was flawless, designed to command absolute authority and radiate an aura of untouchable dominance. It was not the kind of outfit you wore to negotiate. It was the outfit you wore to conquer. I held the crimson jacket up against my reflection in the full-length mirror. For 7 years, I had hidden my face from the public eye. I had allowed the financial world to speculate, to assume that the brilliant mind behind Apex Holdings belonged to an older, seasoned Wall Street veteran. I had kept my identity a closely guarded secret to protect my peace and avoid the relentless scrutiny of the media. But Julian and Vivienne had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They had threatened my children. They had insulted my mother. They had attempted to strip me of my dignity and throw me out onto the street. Hiding was no longer an option. It was time to show the Vance family and the rest of the world exactly who held the keys to the kingdom. I turned away from the mirror, keeping the crimson suit draped over my arm, and picked up my secure corporate phone. I bypassed my usual chain of command and dialed a highly restricted direct number for the executive production desk at CNBC. The phone rang only twice before a senior producer answered, his tone professional and slightly rushed. "This is the executive desk. How can I help you?" he said. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the absolute certainty of my decision settle firmly in my chest. "This is Maya," I said, my voice cold, clear, and perfectly composed. "I am the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings. You have been requesting an exclusive live interview with me for the past 3 years. I am officially accepting your invitation." The line went completely silent for a few seconds as the producer processed the magnitude of the call. "Ma'am, is this a joke?" he finally stammered. "No joke," I replied smoothly. "I am ready to reveal my face to the public. I will be at your downtown Atlanta studio this Monday morning at 8:45. We will discuss the Vance real estate acquisition live on air at 9 o'clock. Cancel whatever programming you have scheduled. Set the cameras." Monday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky over the city of Atlanta. While I was sitting in the quiet, heavily guarded green room at the CNBC downtown studios, breathing evenly and waiting for my makeup to be perfectly set by the network professionals, a completely different scene was unfolding miles away in the affluent suburbs. Thanks to the fact that half of Julian's pathetic fraternity brothers were actively live-streaming the entire morning on their public social media accounts, I had a front-row seat to their spectacular delusion. Vivienne had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate what she firmly believed was their ultimate financial salvation. She had catered a massive, over-the-top watch party at their sprawling Vance family estate. The sweeping circular driveway was packed end-to-end with expensive luxury vehicles, most of which were likely leased or heavily financed, just like Chloe's repossessed Porsche. A small army of hired valets in crisp white uniforms scrambled to park the incoming cars, while a team of professional caterers moved swiftly through the manicured gardens, carrying silver trays of imported caviar, truffle-infused appetizers, and miniature quiches. Vivienne was holding court in the center of her massive grand living room, completely back in her element. She was wearing a brand new, sharply tailored white designer pantsuit, acting as if the humiliating confrontation at the coffee shop had never even occurred. She floated effortlessly from group to group, greeting the elite members of her country club, local politicians, and wealthy socialites with double cheek kisses and a shrill, completely artificial laugh. Waiters in black ties circulated constantly, ensuring that every single guest had a crystal flute filled to the brim with expensive vintage mimosas. The sheer extravagance of the morning was sickening, especially knowing that every single catered appetizer and drop of champagne was being paid for by maxed-out credit cards and the massive toxic loans that I now legally owned. They were throwing a lavish victory parade on the deck of a sinking ship. The grand living room was packed shoulder to shoulder with Atlanta's high society, all eagerly waiting to witness the formal announcement of the $50 million Apex Holdings acquisition. Vivienne was loudly telling anyone who would listen that this merger was merely a stepping stone for the Vance empire, boasting that Julian was a true visionary who was about to take their family legacy to unprecedented global heights. Chloe was also there, standing near the massive marble fireplace, aggressively sipping her mimosa and glaring at anyone who dared to look at her feet, having been forced to catch a ride to the party since her prized sports car was currently sitting in a secure impound lot under my direct corporate orders. But the true star of this pathetic circus was undoubtedly Julian. Julian had positioned himself directly in the center of the room, standing proudly in front of a massive 80-inch flat-screen television that dominated the far wall. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that undoubtedly cost thousands of dollars, holding a freshly poured glass of champagne in his right hand. His new fiancée, the state senator's daughter, was clinging tightly to his left arm, flashing her massive diamond ring for the cameras and smiling like a pageant queen. Julian was entirely surrounded by his old college fraternity brothers, a group of loud, incredibly arrogant men who fed directly into his massive ego, alongside a handful of nervous but greedy private investors who were desperate for this buyout to save their own sinking portfolios. Someone clinked a silver spoon against a crystal glass, calling the noisy room to attention. Julian cleared his throat, puffing out his chest, as the crowd of elites quieted down and turned their expectant faces toward him. He raised his champagne flute, basking in the glow of their collective admiration. "I want to thank all of you for being here today to witness history." Julian began, his voice dripping with an intoxicating mix of extreme arrogance and supreme self-satisfaction. "When I took over the reins of the Vance Real Estate Group, I promised my mother that I would not only protect our generational wealth, but I would multiply it. Today, that promise becomes a reality." His fraternity brothers let out a loud, obnoxious cheer. Julian smiled, a cold, predatory smirk spreading across his face. He took a sip of his drink and continued his grand speech. "It takes a brilliant business mind to orchestrate a $50 million buyout from a titan like Apex Holdings," he bragged, completely oblivious to the fact that his supposed business genius was nothing more than a carefully laid trap. "It takes relentless dedication and a refusal to settle for anything less than absolute perfection. But success also requires knowing when to make the hard sacrifices. It requires knowing when to cut off the dead weight that is holding you back." He paused, looking down at his fiancée and giving her a sickeningly sweet smile before looking back at the crowd. "As many of you know, I recently had to make some very tough personal decisions to protect this empire. I had to trim the fat from my life. I had to walk away from a situation and a person that brought absolutely nothing to the table but lower-class mediocrity and unnecessary financial burdens." The crowd murmured in agreement, a few of the older country club members nodding solemnly at his thinly veiled, deeply misogynistic insult directed entirely at me. Julian raised his glass even higher, projecting his voice. "But today is not about the past," he declared loudly. "Today is about the future. Today the Vance name becomes immortal." Right at that exact moment, the heavy grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9 o'clock. A sudden hush fell over the crowded living room as the massive 80-inch television screen shifted from commercial breaks back to the live CNBC studio feed. The bright blue and white breaking news graphics flashed aggressively across the screen, accompanied by the dramatic pulsing theme music of the morning financial report. The lead male anchor, a seasoned financial journalist, known for his hard-hitting corporate interviews and no-nonsense approach, appeared sitting at the sleek glass news desk. Julian eagerly motioned for one of the waiters to grab the remote and turn the volume up to its maximum level. The anchor looked directly into the camera, his expression completely serious and professionally composed. "Good morning, and welcome back to the Global Market Watch," the anchor announced, his voice echoing loudly through the Vance family living room. "We have an unprecedented breaking story for you this morning. For the past 7 years, Apex Holdings has been one of the most aggressive, highly successful, and completely mysterious private equity firms in the world. Their massive corporate takeovers have reshaped entire industries, dominating the real estate and tech sectors. Yet the founder and chief executive officer of the company has remained entirely anonymous, operating strictly from the shadows and communicating only through a highly guarded board of directors. The camera angle shifted slightly, showing a wide shot of the studio, though the guest chair remained temporarily cast in darkness. Julian leaned forward, his eyes wide with greedy anticipation, completely captivated by the broadcast. Vivienne stepped up beside him, placing a proud hand on his shoulder, her diamond rings sparkling under the chandeliers. "Today, that absolute secrecy officially comes to an end." The news anchor continued, his tone rising with palpable excitement. "In a historic move that has already sent massive shockwaves through the early morning financial markets, the secretive billionaire CEO of Apex Holdings has finally stepped out of the shadows and is sitting live in our studio right now." The crowd inside the Vance estate gasped in collective awe, entirely mesmerized by the unfolding television drama. The anchor looked down at his digital notes before looking back up at the camera lens. "And they are here today to directly address the highly anticipated $50 million acquisition of the Atlanta-based Vance Real Estate Group." Upon hearing their own family name broadcast on live national television alongside the word billionaire, the entire living room erupted into absolute pandemonium. Julian's fraternity brothers began hollering and clapping him on the back so hard he nearly spilled his champagne. Vivienne raised her hands in the air, letting out a sharp cry of absolute victory, genuine tears of joy actually welling up in her eyes. The state senator's daughter kissed Julian passionately on the cheek, whispering her congratulations. The Vance family and all of their elite friends cheered wildly, raising their crystal flutes in a massive toast, completely oblivious to the brutal financial slaughter that was merely seconds away. The live television broadcast continued to roll, the dramatic theme music fading out as the lead anchor turned his attention toward the heavy soundproof studio doors positioned on the far side of the set. I took a slow, deep, calming breath. The main camera smoothly panned across the brightly lit room, adjusting its focus to capture the historic entrance. Every single eye in the Vance family living room was glued to the massive flat screen, anticipating the arrival of an older, gray-haired corporate titan in a conservative navy suit. Instead, the heavy double doors slowly glided open, and I stepped out from the shadows into the harsh glare of the studio lights. I was wearing the bespoke crimson power suit, my posture perfectly straight, radiating an aura of absolute authority and untouchable dominance. The vibrant red fabric stood out starkly against the sleek glass background of the newsroom set. The camera operators immediately pushed in, executing a slow, deliberate zoom that filled the television screens of millions of viewers across the country with a crystal-clear close-up of my face. I walked with steady, measured steps across the polished studio floor, offering a brief nod to the crew before taking my seat in the white leather guest chair, positioned directly opposite the anchor. I crossed my legs, rested my hands calmly on my lap, and stared straight into the primary camera lens, my expression completely unreadable and entirely devoid of fear. Back at the sprawling Vance estate, the deafening wall of celebratory noise evaporated into thin air. The transition from chaotic drunken cheering to absolute silence was instantaneous and incredibly violent. It was as if all the oxygen had been simultaneously sucked out of the grand living room. Dozens of wealthy socialites, politicians, and private investors froze completely solid, holding their crystal champagne flutes suspended in midair like perfectly sculpted statues. The obnoxious frat brothers stopped their aggressive backslapping, their mouths hanging open in genuine confusion. The state senator's daughter blinked rapidly, her perfectly manicured hand tightening its grip around Julian's arm as she tried to make sense of the sudden shift in the room's energy. Vivienne stood frozen in the exact center of the crowd, her new white pantsuit suddenly looking absurdly out of place against her rapidly paling complexion. Her eyes were stretched impossibly wide, glued to the massive 80-inch screen, her brain completely short-circuiting, as it violently rejected the visual information being fed to it. She was looking right at the woman she had mercilessly insulted at a coffee shop just days prior. The sheer impossibility of the moment paralyzed her entirely. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound left in the entire mansion was the crisp voice of the television anchor broadcasting from the speakers, cutting through the heavy graveyard silence of the room. The heavy silence in the Vance living room was violently shattered by the sound of breaking crystal. Julian's fingers had gone completely numb, losing all motor function as the sheer terror of the situation washed over his body. The expensive champagne flute slipped from his grasp, plummeting toward the floor and violently exploding against the imported Italian marble. Sharp shards of glass and expensive vintage champagne splashed outward, soaking the cuffs of his custom-tailored navy trousers, but he did not even flinch. He stumbled backward, knocking into a high-top cocktail table and sending a silver tray of appetizers crashing to the ground. His face was completely drained of blood, making him look like a terrified ghost. "This is not real," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently it was barely audible over the television. Right next to him, Chloe completely lost whatever tiny grip on reality she had left. She pushed her way to the front of the crowd, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "It is a prank!" she shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically. "It is a deepfake. Someone hacked the network. She is just a broke video editor. Turn it off. Turn the TV off right now." She wildly looked around for the remote, aggressively shoving a waiter out of her way in her blind panic. But nobody reached for the remote. The wealthy investors and country club elites were far too captivated by the unfolding disaster to look away. Vivienne let out a horrible, strangled, gasping sound. She stumbled backward, her hand flying up to clutch tightly at the fabric over her chest, as a sharp, genuine physical pain pierced her heart. Her legs gave out completely and she collapsed heavily onto a velvet armchair, struggling violently to draw air into her tightening lungs. She stared at my face on the screen, the horrific realization finally sinking its claws into her mind. The woman she had legally bullied, harassed, and attempted to pay off with a pathetic $100,000 check was sitting on national television. The anchor turned slightly in his chair, folding his hands over his desk and looked directly into the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," the anchor announced, his voice carrying the heavy weight of financial history. "It is my absolute honor to introduce you to the brilliant mind behind one of the most aggressive private equity firms of our generation. Please welcome the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole owner of Apex Holdings Maya." Hearing my name broadcast alongside that title sent a visible shockwave through the room. Several private investors immediately pulled out their cell phones, desperately dialing their brokers in a state of absolute panic. The state senator's daughter forcefully ripped her hand away from Julian's arm, taking 3 large steps backward, as if he were suddenly infected with a highly contagious disease. The illusion of the powerful Vance family had evaporated in less than 30 seconds. Julian stood alone in the center of the mess he had created, staring at my televised image, fully realizing that the woman he had thrown away was actually the executioner sent to end his entire empire. Back inside the brightly lit television studio, I remained a picture of absolute terrifying calm. "Thank you for having me," I said to the anchor. The anchor offered a respectful nod before diving straight into the heavy-hitting journalism that had built his career. "You have maintained a completely unprecedented level of anonymity for the past 7 years," he began. "The financial sector has constantly speculated about your identity, your background, and your incredibly aggressive acquisition strategies. Why choose today of all days to finally step into the public spotlight and reveal yourself to the world?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the arms of the white leather chair. I took a deep breath. Because my firm is currently navigating a highly sensitive transition, I replied smoothly. We operate on a foundation of absolute transparency and unshakable integrity. When an acquisition deal of massive public interest is on the table, I believe the shareholders, the market, and the public deserve to hear the final verdict directly from the source. I wanted to look my investors in the eye when I delivered the news. Let us talk about that exact news, he said, his tone sharpening. The entire Atlanta real estate market, as well as several major Wall Street hedge funds, have been eagerly watching your firm for weeks. The proposed $50 million merger with the Vance Real Estate Group is highly anticipated. Julian Vance has publicly stated on multiple occasions that this deal is an absolute certainty, a perfect synergy of legacy and corporate power. The financial world is waiting for your signature. Can you officially confirm today that Apex Holdings is moving forward with the acquisition of the Vance empire? The camera angle switched immediately, providing a tight close-up of my face. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of that broadcast. I knew Julian was standing in his ruined living room, completely surrounded by his terrified investors, and his hyperventilating mother watching my every single micro-expression. I knew he was silently praying to whatever God he believed in, desperately hoping that I would somehow stick to the corporate script and save him from total ruin. I looked directly into the primary camera lens, piercing through the glass and staring straight into Julian's soul. Slowly, deliberately, I let a smile spread across my face. It was not a warm, friendly smile. It was a cold, lethal, entirely predatory smirk that promised absolute destruction. It was the exact same smile I had given him in the hospital hallway right before I walked onto the elevator. Back in the mansion, watching that smile broadcast on an 80-inch high-definition screen, Julian felt the blood in his veins turn completely to ice. He was paralyzed. A violent shiver racked his entire body as the absolute certainty of his impending doom finally crushed his spirit. I held that chilling smile for 3 full seconds, letting the suspense build to an agonizing peak before I parted my lips to deliver the final execution. Now, I looked directly into the camera lens, knowing with absolute certainty that Julian was watching my every single movement on that massive high-definition screen. I knew his heart was pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal. I knew Vivienne was gasping for air in her ruined living room. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands calmly on the white leather desk, and spoke with the icy, unwavering precision of a corporate executioner. I have reviewed the Vance portfolio in its entirety, I announced, my voice cutting through the silent studio and broadcasting out to millions of viewers across the globe. And I am here today to make a formal public declaration. Not only am I canceling the $50 million merger, but my forensic accountants have uncovered systemic fraud within their firm. The studio crew let out an audible collective gasp. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the newsroom. Live television was usually heavily scripted and carefully managed by corporate public relations teams, but I had just dropped a nuclear bomb on a highly publicized business deal without a single warning. The lead anchor blinked rapidly, completely taken aback by the sheer brutality of my statement. On his desk, his digital monitor immediately began flashing bright red as the stock market algorithms violently reacted to my words, instantly tanking whatever remaining value the Vance Real Estate Group possessed. He leaned forward, smelling the journalistic scoop of a lifetime, his professional composure briefly slipping to reveal genuine shock. Miss Maya, the anchor, stammered slightly, adjusting his earpiece. Those are incredibly severe allegations to make on a live national broadcast. Are you officially stating that the Vance family has been operating a fraudulent enterprise? I did not blink. I did not waver. I kept my eyes locked onto the camera lens, speaking directly to the man who had abandoned his newborn children for a trust fund that no longer existed. I am stating it as an absolute, verifiable legal fact, I replied smoothly. My firm operates with the highest level of due diligence. When we initiated the acquisition audit, we expected to find a prestigious historic real estate portfolio. Instead, we found a highly sophisticated criminal operation entirely disguised as a legacy business. I paused, letting the heavy weight of the word criminal sink into the minds of everyone watching. The $50 million buyout was never a strategic market move for Julian Vance. It was a desperate last-minute attempt to secure a massive financial bailout before the federal authorities discovered his crimes. The anchor sat up entirely straight, the gravity of the situation fully setting in. "Can you elaborate on the specific nature of this fraud?" he asked, his voice tight with anticipation. The public and certainly the investors involved with the Vance firm deserve to know the truth. I offered a slow, deliberate nod. "I would be more than happy to expose the rot," I said, shifting my posture to project absolute authority. For the past 4 years, Julian and Vivienne Vance have systematically embezzled tens of millions of dollars directly from their own company coffers. They have been secretly siphoning commercial tenant security deposits, manipulating their quarterly balance sheets, and defrauding their private investors to fund an obscenely lavish, entirely fake lifestyle. I looked straight into the camera again, making sure my next words pierced directly through Julian's massive ego. They used corporate funds to charter private jets to the Bahamas for weekend parties. They drained employee pension accounts to purchase luxury sports cars and designer wardrobes. Vivienne Vance has been utilizing forged company ledgers to secure massive high-interest loans from predatory shadow lenders, simply to maintain her country club memberships and purchase counterfeit designer handbags. I continued my relentless assault, stripping away every single layer of their carefully constructed elite facade. "They do not possess generational wealth," I stated firmly, my voice echoing with righteous, unapologetic justice. "The Vance family is completely, unequivocally bankrupt. They are insolvent and bleeding cash on a daily basis. Every single property they claim to own is heavily mortgaged beyond its actual market value. They have been running a glorified Ponzi scheme, relying entirely on the false promise of the Apex Holdings merger to pay off their massive debts. I have already forwarded our complete forensic audit, including all the hidden shadow ledgers and forged bank signatures, directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By the end of this broadcast, Julian Vance will no longer be considered a corporate executive. He will be considered a prime suspect in a massive federal fraud investigation." I knew exactly what was happening at the sprawling Vance estate at that very second. The luxurious watch party had instantly transformed into a chaotic crime scene. The wealthy private investors who had foolishly given Julian their money were likely screaming at the top of their lungs, demanding their funds back and threatening massive lawsuits. His obnoxious fraternity brothers were undoubtedly backing away from him, desperately trying to distance themselves from a man about to be indicted by the federal government. And the state senator's daughter, the woman Julian had proudly paraded around as his new upper-class prize, was probably slipping that massive diamond ring off her finger and sprinting toward the nearest exit to protect her father's political career. Julian was standing in the center of his grand living room, completely surrounded by the shattered glass of his champagne flute, watching his entire universe violently collapse into dust. He had thrown me away because he refused to be poor, but his own greed had just guaranteed him a future wearing a prison jumpsuit. The television anchor looked visibly pale. He glanced down at his notes and then back up at me, clearly struggling to comprehend the massive scale of the financial slaughter he was currently broadcasting. "If the Vance Real Estate Group is completely insolvent and drowning in toxic debt from shadow lenders, what happens to their properties?" the anchor asked, his voice hushed with awe. "What happens to the creditors who are currently owed millions of dollars?" I waited for a full second, letting the studio fall completely silent. This was the moment I had been planning since the day I walked out of that hospital ward. This was the ultimate, inescapable death blow. I folded my hands neatly on the desk and delivered the final strike. "There are no shadow lenders anymore," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper. "Furthermore, Apex Holdings has aggressively purchased all of their outstanding debt. Every single promissory note, every single hidden mortgage, and every single defaulted credit line is now legally owned by my firm." The anchor's jaw physically dropped. "You bought their debt," he repeated, entirely stunned by the sheer ruthlessness of the maneuver. I nodded once. I did. Which means I am now their sole and primary creditor. I completely own the Vance family. And because they are in severe default across every single one of their accounts, I am initiating immediate unforgiving foreclosure on all Vance properties. I stared directly into the camera, knowing my eyes were locked onto Julian's. That includes their corporate headquarters downtown. That includes their luxury vehicles. And most importantly, that includes the sprawling ancestral estate they are currently standing in. I have already dispatched my private security teams and local law enforcement officials to every single Vance property. Process servers are waiting at their front gates right now with official eviction notices. The Vance family has exactly 2 hours to pack whatever cheap, personal belongings they can carry and vacate my properties immediately. If they are still inside my buildings when the clock strikes noon, they will be physically removed for trespassing. I leaned back in the white leather chair, the heavy crimson fabric of my suit settling perfectly around my shoulders. I had taken the cheap plastic bags Chloe had offered me in the hospital and metaphorically wrapped them tightly around their entire miserable empire. They thought they were untouchable because of their last name and their country club status. They thought they could discard a mother and her newborn children like garbage without facing a single consequence. But I had just proved to the entire world that true power does not come from renting a cubic zirconia necklace or bragging about a trust fund. True power comes from absolute financial dominance and the strategic patience to let your enemies dig their own graves. I smiled at the anchor, completely unbothered by the absolute destruction I had just caused. I believe that concludes the business regarding the Vance merger, I said politely. Are there any other market trends you would like to discuss today? Exactly an hour after I uttered those final words on national television, the towering glass doors of the Apex Holdings global headquarters were violently pushed open. My corporate building was a fortress of smoked glass and black steel, located in the absolute center of the financial district, a towering monument to the massive empire I had built from nothing. The expansive ground floor lobby was a masterpiece of minimalist design featuring polished slate floors, towering indoor water features, and a massive circular reception desk manned by highly trained personnel. The atmosphere was usually one of hushed, respectful corporate efficiency. But Julian and Vivienne brought the chaotic, frantic energy of a street brawl directly into my sanctuary. They had somehow managed to completely bypass the outer gate security, likely by screaming at the valet attendants and abandoning their vehicle right in the middle of the busy intersection. They stormed into the pristine lobby looking absolutely unhinged. The perfectly manicured elite facade they had spent decades cultivating was entirely gone. Julian's expensive custom suit was severely wrinkled and stained with dried champagne, his silk tie loosened and hanging crookedly around his neck. His face was flushed red with exertion and sheer panic. Vivienne looked even worse. Her pristine white designer pantsuit was rumpled. Her heavily contoured makeup was visibly smudged from sweating, and her normally perfect hair was in wild disarray. She looked exactly like the desperate, frantic, bankrupt woman she truly was. They rushed the front desk, screaming at the top of their lungs, completely ignoring the shocked stares of my corporate employees and visiting executives. "I demand to see Maya right this second!" Vivienne shrieked, slamming her heavily ringed hands down hard against the polished granite counter. "Call her down here immediately. This is a massive misunderstanding, and she is going to fix it right now, or I will have this entire building condemned." The receptionist, a seasoned professional who was well accustomed to dealing with high-pressure situations, calmly reached under the desk and pressed the silent alarm. Julian aggressively stepped up beside his mother, pointing a shaking finger at the glass barrier separating them from the executive elevators. "You tell her her husband is here," Julian yelled, his voice cracking hysterically completely, forgetting that he had aggressively forced me to sign divorce papers just 3 months prior. "You tell her she cannot do this to my family. We are the Vance family. We own this city." Two large, broad-shouldered security guards in tailored black suits immediately stepped out from the shadows of the lobby, moving swiftly to intercept them. They physically blocked Julian and Vivienne from advancing any further, their hands resting firmly on their tactical belts. "Sir, ma'am, you need to step back from the desk immediately," the lead guard commanded, his voice deep and authoritative. "You are trespassing on private property. If you do not calm down and leave the premises, we will forcefully remove you." Vivienne tried to aggressively push past the massive guard, her acrylic nails digging into the sleeve of his suit. "Get your hands off me, you oversized mall cop," she spat venomously. "I am Vivienne Vance, and I am not leaving this lobby until that little gold digger comes down here and answers to me." Right as the lead security guard reached out to physically restrain her, a soft electronic chime echoed through the massive cavernous space of the lobby. Everyone froze and turned their heads toward the rear wall. The private, highly restricted biometric elevator reserved exclusively for the chief executive officer was descending from the top floor. The elevator car was constructed entirely of thick bulletproof glass, allowing everyone in the lobby to watch my descent. I stood perfectly still in the center of the glass box, still wearing my bespoke crimson power suit, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I was flanked by my personal security detail, two heavily armed former military operatives who never left my side. The visual contrast between us was absolutely staggering. I was the absolute picture of composed, untouchable power, descending from the sky to cast final judgment. They were standing on the ground floor, looking like frantic, disheveled peasants begging at the gates of a castle they could never hope to enter. The glass doors slid open with a quiet mechanical hiss. I stepped out onto the polished slate floor, my high heels clicking sharply against the stone. My security detail fanned out immediately, creating an impenetrable human barrier between me and the Vance family. The entire lobby had gone dead silent. Dozens of my employees had stopped walking, watching the spectacle unfold with bated breath. Julian took a step forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and pathetic hope. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice trembling pitifully. "You have to stop this. You are destroying everything. You cannot just take our company and our home." Before I could even open my mouth to respond to his pathetic whining, Vivienne aggressively shoved him aside. Her massive ego simply could not handle the reality of being completely subjugated by a woman she considered inferior. She desperately tried to summon whatever scraps of high society authority she had left, puffing out her chest and glaring at me with raw, unfiltered hatred. "You think you are so incredibly smart, do you not?" Vivienne hissed, taking a step toward my security guards. "You think putting on a cheap red suit and throwing some big corporate words around on television makes you a billionaire. You are nothing but a vindictive, lying little fraud. You went on national television and completely destroyed the pristine reputation of the Vance Real Estate Group. You made up completely baseless lies about my finances and my business practices just because you were bitter that my son finally threw you out like the garbage you are." She took a deep, ragged breath, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "I am going to sue you for everything you are worth," she screamed, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. "I am going to hire the most ruthless, aggressive defamation lawyers on the East Coast. I will drag you through federal court for the next 10 years. I will prove to the world that you are a complete psychopath who hacked our accounts and fabricated those numbers. By the time I am finished with you, you will not even have that cheap little apartment left. I am going to destroy you, Maya. I am going to wipe your name off the face of the earth." I did not react to her screaming. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not look intimidated. I simply stood there, letting her completely exhaust herself with her empty, meaningless threats. When she finally stopped yelling to catch her breath, panting heavily in her ruined designer suit, I slowly extended my right hand. The security operative standing immediately to my left reached into his tactical briefcase and handed me a thick, heavy black leather binder. The binder was stuffed completely full of printed spreadsheets, bank records, and legal contracts marked with the bright red seal of my forensic accounting department. I held the heavy binder in my hands for a brief moment, feeling the absolute weight of their destruction. Then with a flick of my wrist, I casually tossed the massive binder through the air. It landed forcefully on the polished slate floor, right at Vivienne's expensive shoes, hitting the ground with a loud, satisfying thud that echoed through the dead, silent lobby. The heavy metal rings popped open on impact, spilling dozens of highly classified documents across the floor. There is no defamation when every single word I said was the absolute truth. I said, my voice cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of mercy. I want you to look very closely at the papers scattered around your feet, Vivienne. That binder contains the physical receipts of every single crime you have committed over the last 4 years. Julian stared down at the papers, his face turning an even sicker shade of pale. I pointed my toe toward a specific bank statement resting near my heel. Right there is the forged signature you used to illegally siphon $300,000 from your commercial tenant's security deposit fund just to pay for your summer yacht rental in Monaco, I explained calmly. Over there are the illegal wire transfers you authorized to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to hide your failing assets from the federal government. And right next to your left shoe is the incredibly sloppy, highly fraudulent property appraisal you submitted to the shadow lenders to secure a $10 million loan on a building that was literally sinking into the ground. Vivienne stared down at the documents, her eyes darting frantically over the highlighted numbers and the blatantly forged signatures. The last remaining drops of color completely drained from her face. Her lower lip began to tremble violently. "You cannot legally use these," she whispered, her voice completely stripped of its former arrogance. "These are private internal company records. You stole them." I smiled a dark, terrifying expression. "I did not steal anything, Vivienne. When you desperately offered your company up for acquisition, you legally authorized a full financial audit. You opened your own books to my investigators. You handed me the murder weapon and begged me to pull the trigger." I took a slow step forward, forcing her to look up and meet my eyes. "So go ahead," I challenged her, my voice dropping to a lethal, unwavering pitch. "Call your high-priced lawyers. File a massive defamation lawsuit against me today. The very second your attorney files that paperwork in a civil court, I will personally hand-deliver every single original document in that binder directly to the regional director of the FBI. I will make sure the Department of Justice launches a full-scale criminal investigation into your entire family by sunset. You will not be fighting me in a corporate boardroom. You will be fighting federal prosecutors in a criminal courtroom. You will be indicted for massive wire fraud, tax evasion, and severe corporate embezzlement." I looked her up and down, taking in her ruined designer clothes and her pathetic broken posture. "Sue me, Vivienne, and I promise you will trade your Chanel for a prison jumpsuit before the week is over." Vivienne stared at me, her mouth opening and closing but producing absolutely no sound. The terrifying reality of federal prison finally shattered whatever fragile remnants of her massive ego still existed. She slowly sank down onto her knees right there in the middle of the corporate lobby, her shaking hands weakly gathering the scattered, highly incriminating financial documents, as if hiding the pieces of paper now would somehow magically rewrite her criminal past. Seeing his formidable mother utterly defeated and reduced to a weeping, pathetic mess on the floor completely broke Julian. The arrogant, entitled frat boy persona he had paraded around his living room all morning instantly evaporated into thin air. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically around the lobby, desperately searching for any possible escape route from the massive catastrophe he had blindly orchestrated. When he finally realized that neither his fake wealth, his mother, nor his expensive lawyers could save him from the absolute destruction I had unleashed, he resorted to the only weapon he thought he still possessed: emotional manipulation. Julian took 2 stumbling steps forward and dramatically dropped to his knees right beside his mother. The loud thud of his kneecaps hitting the polished slate floor echoed through the dead, silent lobby. Genuine tears began to stream down his flushed face, though I knew with absolute certainty that he was only crying out of pure self-pity. "Maya, please," he sobbed loudly, clasping his trembling hands together in a desperate gesture of begging. I am so incredibly sorry. I was wrong about absolutely everything. You have to believe me. I never wanted this. My mother forced me into all of it. She pressured me to sign those divorce papers. She threatened to cut me off and completely destroy my life if I did not leave you in that hospital room. I never actually wanted to leave you. You are the love of my life. You have always been the love of my life. I stared down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. He was a grown man in his 30s, a supposed corporate titan currently blaming his mommy for his own vile, unforgivable choices. Julian reached out desperately, trying to grab the hem of my crimson suit pants, but my lead security operative immediately stepped forward, kicking Julian's hand away with the heavy toe of his tactical boot. Julian recoiled, sobbing even harder, snot running down his face and completely ruining his expensive appearance. Maya, we can fix this, he pleaded, his voice cracking pitifully as he looked up at me. We are a family. We belong together. Please, just call off the lawyers and the federal authorities. Let me come home to you right now. I want to be a real father. I want to see my beautiful children. I miss Zion and Zuri so much. Please, I am begging you, let me see my babies. We can be the perfect wealthy family you always wanted. I looked down at the pathetic weeping man kneeling on the floor of my corporate lobby. He was actively invoking the names of the very children he had discarded like trash just to save his own wallet. The sheer audacity of his request was almost laughable, but I did not smile. Instead, I calmly reached inside the inner breast pocket of my tailored crimson jacket. I had been carrying one specific document with me every single day since the morning I left the maternity ward, waiting for the exact perfect moment to finally use it. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper neatly folded into perfect thirds. I slowly unfolded the document and held it out so Julian could clearly see the bold black text printed at the top, along with his own messy signature scrawled across the bottom line. Julian squinted through his tears, his weeping abruptly stopping as he recognized the hospital letterhead and the legal seal. Do not ever speak the names of my children again, I said, my voice dropping to a freezing absolute zero temperature that made the surrounding executives shiver. You do not have any children, Julian. You legally abandoned them in a hospital room mere hours after they were cut out of my body because you were too incredibly cheap to buy diapers and pay child support. You traded your own flesh and blood for an old Honda Civic and a trust fund that was entirely made of toxic shadow debt. Julian stared blindly at the parental surrender form, the color draining from his face once again as the massive, inescapable trap finally clamped completely shut around him. I tapped my manicured fingernail directly against his signature on the bottom line. This piece of paper is my ultimate shield, I explained, making sure every single word was crystal clear to his panicking brain. By signing away your parental rights to avoid paying for your own babies, you permanently and legally severed all ties to my family line. And because of this exact signature, you have absolutely zero legal claim to my multi-billion-dollar estate. You cannot take me to family court. You cannot demand spousal support. You cannot demand a single penny of child support or visitation rights to access my money. You willingly wrote yourself entirely out of the greatest generational wealth this city has ever seen. You thought you were protecting your money from a peasant gold digger, but you actually locked yourself completely out of an empire. I carefully folded the document back up and slipped it safely into my jacket pocket, ensuring it would never be touched by his hands. I looked at the lead security guard standing to my right, giving him a single, sharp nod of authorization. Security, I commanded, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. Throw these trespassers out. The two massive security operatives did not hesitate for a single second. They stepped forward and forcefully grabbed Julian and Vivienne by the arms, hauling them roughly up from the polished slate floor like sacks of worthless garbage. Vivienne began to kick and scream hysterically, her expensive high heels slipping wildly on the stone as she loudly demanded to be put down and threatened to call the police. Julian went completely limp, his spirit entirely broken, openly weeping into his hands as the guards dragged him backward toward the lobby exit. The entire staff of Apex Holdings watched in absolute stunned silence as the former king and queen of Atlanta high society were physically marched out of the building. The guards shoved them aggressively through the heavy revolving doors, sending them stumbling out onto the busy downtown concrete sidewalk. They collapsed onto the street completely ruined, publicly humiliated, and entirely destitute, with a massive federal fraud investigation waiting to arrest them before the sun even set. I turned my back on the glass doors and walked calmly back into my private elevator, the metal doors sliding shut on the Vance family forever. 3 years later, the blazing afternoon sun shined brightly over the sprawling, meticulously manicured gardens of my private estate. My home was not built on toxic debt or shadow loans like the Vance mansion. It was built on real equity, brilliant corporate strategy, and unapologetic hard work. The toxic memories of Julian and Vivienne were nothing more than a distant, pathetic footnote in the history of my massive success. I sat on a plush outdoor sofa on my wide stone patio sipping a glass of freshly squeezed iced lemonade. Joyful laughter filled the warm air. Zion and Zuri, now highly energetic and beautiful toddlers, were running happily across the lush green grass, chasing a brightly colored butterfly toward the rose bushes. They were completely safe, deeply loved, and entirely protected from the poisonous arrogance of the family that had tried to throw them away. I had successfully broken the generational curse of poverty and trauma that Vivienne had mocked, and I had single-handedly built a fortress of true, unshakable generational wealth for my children. They would grow up knowing the true value of integrity and absolute financial independence. They would never have to beg anyone for a seat at the table because they already owned the entire dining room. I watched my children play, a profound sense of peace settling permanently into my heart. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I hope my journey reminds you that your true worth is never determined by the people who are too blind and arrogant to see it. Have you ever had to deal with an incredibly toxic mother-in-law or a partner who completely underestimated your value and tried to break you down? How did you stand your ground and take your power back from them? I would absolutely love to hear your personal stories and strategies in the comments section below. If this story resonated with you, and you want to hear more content about overcoming toxic family dynamics, building your own empire, and finding ultimate justice, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Do not forget to share this video with anyone who might need a powerful reminder that the absolute best revenge is always massive, undeniable success. Remember, you hold the pen to your own life story, so make sure you write yourself a beautiful, triumphant ending. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.